Hello from the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. I am Captain John Bolen, a Maneuver Battalion Operations Trainer.
And I'm Captain Olivia Schretzman, a Combat Engineer Company Armored and Sapper Company Observer Coach Trainer. Welcome back. In part 1 of our Combined Arms Breach TAC Talk, we covered the doctrinal foundations of the Combined Arms Breach.
Today, we will highlight developments in the current OE, commonly observed trends in breaching here at the National Training Center, and pragmatic ways to improve the planning, preparation, and execution of combined arms breaches.
John, so what trends are we seeing in combined arms breaching in the current operational environment?
In conflicts around the world, we are seeing the most formidable obstacle belts constructed since the Second World War. These obstacle belts consist of 3-tier networks of mines, obstacles, and earthworks. In the most critical sectors, these obstacles can stretch up to 10 kilometers in depth through multiple belts, and individual minefields up to 500 meters deep. Defending forces cover these obstacles with manned and unmanned intelligence collections assets, such as first-person viewer FPV quadcopter drones, satellite reconnaissance, electronic intelligence, and traditional manned observation posts. These collection assets pass real-time intelligence on breaching forces via radio and wire transmissions, video feeds, and even cell phone networks to fires direction centers and individual fires assets. Within minutes of detection, adversaries can deliver precision fires on forces attempting to reconnoiter or execute a combined arms breach.
So based on what you're saying, I'm seeing 3 key issues. First, the support force's inability to suppress both enemy, direct and indirect fires capable of influencing the breach site and obscure against multi-domain enemy reconnaissance. The second is the inability to collect sufficient obstacle and enemy intelligence to effectively plan and prepare for the breach. And then the third, which is really the inability of the breach force to mass sufficient combat power and mobility assets to execute and exploit the breach without being destroyed due to indirect enemy fire.
So we've talked about the current OE. What are you seeing as an engineer OCT? Is it the same or are you seeing different trends?
First, I'd say the early integration of enablers during the planning is critical. That early integration helps build both trust and confidence, and really it's the integration into MDMP and the reverse breach planning process, which is really impossible without it.
It's a science and art, right? The science of actually overlaying reverse breach planning on MDMP and the art of building that trust and confidence. Battalion and brigade staffs can integrate that product into their planning SOPs as a visual reference, a baseline for integrating engineers and all warfighting functions into their MDMP from receipt of mission until orders production.
Absolutely. Something I often see is that units will struggle to use the planning process and delineate responsibilities for actions, reporting, and decisions at or around the breach, such as clearly defining the responsibilities and the decision authorities of the engineer and the breach force commanders, and then relevant C2 nodes.
I think a way that I've seen units actually succeed, though, is that they assign a task and location by C2 node per phase of the combined arms breach, including a generic task and location by C2 node template for combined arms breaching in a battalion and brigade planning standard operating procedure is a great way to mitigate this trend prior to arriving to the National Training Center or participating in large-scale combat. So we've talked planning. What about during preparation?
The biggest is rehearsals. Units normally do a good job allowing time to conduct rehearsals at the battalion and brigade levels. However, these rehearsals are not always as successful in building a shared visualization of the breach in time, space, auditing, and then validating those fighting products, identifying opportunities, the risk, and the triggers, and building trust throughout the task force.
That is such a good point. In fact, the Operations Group's first TAC Talk, Episode 1, A Way to Car, is a reference for executing combined arms breach rehearsals based on years of experience here at the National Training Center. Let's talk about intelligence. It's the first breach tenet for a reason. The units are usually able to identify the point of breach prior to commitment of their main body. The reconnaissance efforts do not identify the composition, orientation, and depth of the obstacle belt. Additionally, this intelligence rarely arrives to the breach force and engineer commanders and staff in time to effectively prepare for and rehearse the actual obstacle belt the engineers will breach.
A good way to frame it is collecting the right PIR and then disseminating that PIR to the right commanders and staff by the last time information of value.
That's a great way of putting it. We need to make sure our limited brigade internal reconnaissance assets, especially in large-scale combat, are focusing on only the most important PIR. This PIR must first answer the most important question: when and where are we going to breach? reconnaissance must identify the weakest viable point of breach in the enemy obstacle belt. And by viable, I mean the terrain on both sides of the point of breach must allow friendly forces to rapidly mass combat power and exploit the breach lane once established. After all, breaching is really to get combat power on the far side, not just to open an obstacle.
And if I think about it, the most essential PIR for engineering planning efforts is really the composition, orientation, and then the depth of that enemy obstacle belt at the point of breach. An engineer attempting to plan a breach without accurate obstacle intelligence is really like a coach calling a play without seeing the field.
And second to that is the composition and disposition of enemy direct fires capable of influencing the point of breach, and any reconnaissance assets capable of observing. Think both the sensor and the shooter. While a brigade can do little organically to quote-unquote kill the archer, it can certainly blind them.
And to that point, you identified that division and above echelons owe a piece of that information collection picture to support of the combined arms breach. And specifically, we're talking about what enemy indirect and for that seaburn, aerial, and electronic fires, and how they're postured to influence the identified point of breach.
Division and up collection can also play a role in identifying the composition, disposition, and reaction time of enemy reserves able to reinforce the breach site, and identifying critical enemy nodes that the assault and exploitation force will target after passing through the breach lane. Again, the breach itself is of little value if it's not properly exploited.
And we've discussed a lot of the trends in breaching planning and preparation, but what do you see that we need to think about through execution?
Units struggle to achieve effective suppression and obscuration at the breach site. And I'm not just talking in regards to enemy direct fires. It's 2024. Suppression is more than denying effective enemy direct fires on a point of breach. Commanders and staff must think of suppression of the enemy capabilities across the 9 forms of contact. For example, brigades must ask divisions to assist in the destruction, disruption, neutralization, or blinding of enemy cannon and rocket artillery batteries within the area of influence prior to committing and massing their own combat power at the point of breach.
That's a really good point. Obscuration also needs to be expanded upon. Commanders and staffs must visualize obscuration across the electromagnetic spectrum and in the physical, human, and information dimensions. Visible light is a common sense one. Employ smoke. But that smoke must effectively deny enemy direct fire line of sight to the point of breach. You don't get points for trying. Smoke should generally be employed on the far side of the obstacle, as close to the obstacle as possible for greatest effects.
Exactly. And I know it's abstract, but obscuration applies across the electromagnetic spectrum. Obscuring radio waves is achieved by practicing emissions control prior to initiating indirect fire suppression to degrade enemy electronic reconnaissance efforts. Physical obscuration includes survivability measures such as dispersion, camouflage, and full spectrum masking. Obscuration in the human dimension includes deception measures to obscure the enemy's view of one's intentions, operational security measures to protect essential elements of friendly information, or EEFI, providing obscuration in the information dimension. Okay, so from an engineer perspective, what trends for improvement do you see in combined arm breach execution here at the National Training Center?
I think far too often we see that engineers and engineer assets are not in the position when the conditions to do the breach are set by the support force.
And from a maneuver perspective, it's not just the engineers. Units typically struggle with terrain management, maintaining tempo before and after the breach, committing forces piecemeal through the breach lane, and can be slow to mass decisive combat power on the far side enemy forces and assault objectives.
But as we are seeing in the current operational environment, it's not as simple as massing assault forces in a column on the near side of a breach, and usually they're waiting for a touchdown call. Units must balance the tenet of mass with the dispersion necessary to survive on the modern battlefield.
And a way to get after that is creating operations graphics with sufficient graphic control measures to allow flexible and dispersed movement to the breach site and rapid concentration to achieve decisive mass at the last possible moment. All right, so let's draw this out using a COA sketch as an example to illuminate these operations graphics that we just discussed. We are starting in attack positions to the south, to the east, and to the north. These attack positions, if possible, should be beyond the effective indirect fire range of enemy cannon and rocket artillery whenever possible to limit the enemy's ability to attrit us prior to massing combat power When this is not possible, allocate at least 1 square kilometer per maneuver company-sized element and employ multiple disaggregated attack positions to further complicate enemy targeting. Between the attack and the assault positions, consider multiple 1 to 2 kilometer wide axes of advance. This is going to allow your maneuver companies and battalions to spread out, get that good dispersion, and again complicate the enemy's ability to disrupt you with indirect fires prior to your massing of combat power. Every 2 to 3 kilometers between the attack positions and the assault positions, consider placing a holding area. A holding area is adopted from wet gap crossing doctrine. These holding areas, dispersed just like your attack positions, allow a place for Unit 1 to know they're on the correct axes of advance with far and near recognition, and 2, to pause so that leaders can reduce friction at the point of breach. So you'll see a force flow from the attack position to the holding area to a subsequent holding area if you have it, and then the assault position. And this is going to help you keep your battalion and brigade dispersed both in time and space instead of backing up like a traffic jam at the point of breach. Just prior to the release line, or the line delineating entry into the breaching area, and just beyond the direct fire range of the enemy at the breach site, lies the assault position. Units should consider establishing multiple platoon or company-sized assault positions arrayed on these multiple axes of advance, an assault area, if you will. Upon departing these assault positions, the separate axes of advance converge to either the point of breach, the support by fire location of your support force. This framework of graphic control measures balances the requirement for control of battalions and brigade-sized elements to mass effects through combining arms with holding off the massing of combat power to the last possible moment to again complicate enemy indirect fire targeting efforts. Brigades will flow from their attack positions to points of breach using visual and FM contact between sequential units to cue forward movement rather than a step top-down direction via FM and JBCP. In the event of prolonged or failed breaches on one or more axes, which is going to happen, this framework keeps a brigade dispersed and difficult to target while leaders move to points of friction and resolve the issues. While it is more difficult than placing a brigade on a single column going down a single MSR, this approach significantly decreases both risk to mission and the force from prolonged exposure to enemy indirect fire's assets.
I really like the framework that you laid out with these operational graphics. These graphics that John explained to you, they need to be paired with a synchronizing product that controls forces moving across the battlefield in time and space. And that masses combined arms effects at the point of breach. The best way I've seen it done is with a well-rehearsed X-check that ties across all warfighting functions to clear triggers. Here's an example of a combined arms breach X-check. You'll notice the trigger column contains one trigger or a list of conditions which must be met in order to call the pro word. Line 5, for example, contains a division-level convergence condition and a brigade internal condition check to be met prior to beginning the operation. The calling of the pro word itself triggers a series of simultaneous actions across the warfighting functions. Actions by warfighting functions, in our example, you can see 9 different actions triggered by pro word Alabama. Ideally, one or more of these actions is a trigger or critical condition for the next pro word, and that ensures that the brigade can execute in a decentralized manner, as conditions are achieved without rigid control. But remember, the enemy and Murphy get a vote. If a trigger or condition is not achieved, the task force commander reaches a decision point to either assume risk and continue as planned, or make adjustments to attempt to reach the desired conditions to execute the next pro word. These decision points are usually captured in an unaccompanied decision support matrix, but it is useful to capture them in the X-check as well.
And remember, an X-check is just a piece of paper if it's not validated both during a combined arms rehearsal and widely distributed to the user level.
I think that comment is a good point to transition to our conclusion, and the most important thing the audience can take from this TAC talk. None of the things that we discussed here, the X-check, operational graphics, PIRs, none of it really matters if the unit culture or the trust up and down the chain of command doesn't understand the breach or understand their role in that combined arms breach. Trust built on demonstrated competence in warfighting, and then leaders showing that they care about their subordinates.
Plans go awry, but when all else fails, we still have the greatest combat power multipliers in the American arsenal: effective combat leadership and the indomitable will of the American soldier.
Thank you for watching this episode of our TAC Talks, and train the force.